By the time India got its freedom, the Parsis were at the forefront of setting large industries and manufacturing plants in India. A new nation needed factories to produce and jobs to create. Forbes Marshall, a diversified engineering company based in Pune, was set up in 1958. The journey of the owners of the company, the Forbes and the Marshall, interestingly reflects the rise of the Parsis and their ability to keep pace with change. I caught up with Dr. Naushad Forbes, the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, who has also been a consulting professor of innovation at Stanford University. I began by asking him about the stories that he grew up with.
So, lots of stories, and lots of stories about some very interesting characters. And I think entrepreneurship very often goes with people who are characters and have, particular idiosyncrasies which we have in abundance in our family, in our history. And I think we're actually rather proud of some of those idiosyncrasies. So, for example, the story that you mentioned about my great-grandfather moving to Bombay, piling up this bullock cart with all of his furniture and so on, and then just taking the bullock cart and moving at that very slow speed.
3 months it took him.
3 months to Bombay.
With lots of stopovers.
Yeah. And then getting into business. And he sort of went from one business to the other. He started off in the cotton trade, but he also got into hay and into handling hay and supplying. At that time, all the trams in Bombay were horse-pulled, and the horses needed to be fed hay. So he started getting concessions to bring in hay from the countryside and supply the horses of Bombay with hay so that the trams would run. And this was not a business that he had any background in, but he just sort of fell into these businesses. And then from the supplying of the hay to the horses that were pulling the trams, he got into supplying coal to ships, and then he started getting into supplying coal to the textile mills of Bombay, and it just sort of went from one thing to the other. But the story about my grandfather, which is sort of the real origins of the company and where the Marshall part of Forbes Marshall comes from, was 1926, when my grandfather, who used to supply mill stores in Ahmedabad, as an agent for another company, another Parsi company. And he set up his own enterprise in 1926 in Bombay. And essentially his father, so my great-grandfather, gave my grandfather and his eldest brother 1,000 rupees each at that time, which was a lot of money in 1926, and said, listen, this is your money, start in business. And so he started in one thing after the other. And I mean, there are these, when I talk about stories, one of the things that my grandfather liked to do, he was an extremely social man who had wonderful relationships that he formed with customers. He was a consummate salesman. I mean, he could sell anything to anyone. And he was a great cards player and loved going to the club. And one of the things that he also did was that he invested in the stock market. And in 1936, when the Bombay stock market collapsed, he lost not only all of his investments in the stock market, but also a significant share of the investments of his father-in-law.
Oh my God.
So, which he'd invested on whose behalf he'd invested too. And so for 3 years, he supported his family on his bridge winnings at the Willingdon Club.
What are you saying? He must have been a fabulous player.
He was a good player, a very good player. And he would go to the Willingdon and he would play with great discipline every day. And when he won a certain amount, he would stop. So unlike a gambler who, the more you win, the more you bet, he had a certain budget. He wanted to make a certain amount from his winnings each day. And once he reached that point, he would say, thank you very much, and he would stop. And people would say, what system do you play? And he'd say the Marshall system, which meant that no one understood what he was doing. But, he was a person of very much of a character and a person who I think anyone who came in touch with him remembered him for the rest of their lives, and I think were marked by that connection. He helped many people get their start in business. A good example is B.G. Shirke of the Shirke Group, where he was a big promoter of B.G. Shirke and in his education, in his later entry into business. He played a part in Venkateshwara Rao because he had a poultry farm, and he said, look, he promised to be his first customer for the chickens that he would breed and so on, and I think he was very much of an entrepreneur and someone who fostered entrepreneurship and risk taking in others and in all the people he came in touch with.
This particular plant in Kasarwadi was built by your father when he
Yes.
came back in 58, I think.
So my father joined my grandfather in 1946, sort of fresh out of engineering college. He joined him in 1946, and that's when the business as we know it now started.
Sure.
So that's when we started getting into steam engineering and then later into control instrumentation. But it started with my father joining my grandfather, the Forbes coming together with the Marshall.
A diversified engineering company today, Forbes Marshall was started by Darius Forbes in 1958. It grew as India's economy grew. Today, it's at the forefront of innovation, something that is driven from the very top.
Very interestingly, people don't realize this about you, but you were teaching at Stanford. You're a PhD in a very interesting area, which is technology-related entrepreneurship. And you've been at the forefront of this whole focus on innovation, So in a sense, you match history with the future in that context. But where do you see the role of innovation in traditional community-driven businesses where, it's always about the legacy, it's never about the look forward? What is your perception of the Parsis in business?
One of the things that both my brother Farad and I do is we are quite involved with family businesses as an organization, with the Family Business Network, with the CII Family Business Network in India, but also Family Business Network International. And one of the key elements of family businesses, they say, is an ability to deal with contradictions. And where seeming contradictions can actually become strengths. So exactly what you're mentioning about legacy. Legacy can actually be a spur for innovation. It needn't be something that holds it back. Because your legacy can actually be a legacy of firsts, of doing things for the first time.
Not basking in the old glory.
So you're proud of your history, but you don't just say, well, my history is everything. And it's because of your history, because you're proud of your history, you say, I have to do something to take this forward. I have to leave this enterprise in better shape than the shape I inherited it. And I think that sense of family business is an heirloom, but an heirloom that you don't just polish up from time to time, but that you have to actually leave in a lot better shape.
So is that how you are approaching your legacy?
I think so. I think that's how both my brother and I have approached our roles. And we see it very fortunately in my brother's children as well, and in the next generation. They have the same, I think, approach to legacy with great pride in what we do, but without any idea that, well, because we have a good history, that's it. Because of the good history, we have to do more. We should be expected to deliver more.
That's interesting because it brings me to the next question, Naushad. One of the biggest challenges, if you have old wealth, is how to keep the hunger alive to add on to the wealth, and not just, take a step aside. Do you think, what are the challenges that family-run businesses face, especially with old communities, and you're fifth, sixth generation now? I mean, what are the challenges faced there?
So I think, keeping the hunger alive, honestly, I don't think comes necessarily from wealth. It comes, I don't want to in any way say that, we live very comfortably. I and the family in general like to live well. But wealth is not why we do what we do at work. You could probably live more comfortably if you sold the business, invested it, and lived off the interest. Yeah. But I think the business is the purpose,
Sure.
actually, and the purpose of why we live and why we do what we do. And where does the hunger come from? I think it comes from potential, and it comes from seeing potential. In that you say, look, I've been given so much. I've been given, this wonderful legacy, a great business model, so much in the way of resources, a wonderful education. I'm going to do something with this.
Sure.
Yeah, and if I don't do something with this, and if I don't deliver on the potential that exists.
That's a fabulous piece of insight. But I'm going to ask you, what do you make of the Parsis in business today? From the heydays, of course the Tatas have been number one through the last couple of decades, and that's quite commendable.
Yeah.
But in a sense, what do you think of Parsi enterprise and industry at this juncture?
So I think I'm very proud that many of the companies that would be held up as sort of statements of how business should be done in the country, like the Tatas, the Godreges, Thermax, if I may say so, us, are companies that are Parsi businesses. I mean, our business is promoted by Parsis originally. So I'm very proud of that. And I'm also clear that it's not only Parsi businesses that are wonderful businesses that contribute, in a terrific way to the country's development. There are so many others that come from all communities. And I think we should value businesses because they're good businesses and they do business in the right way and not because of their community origins.
Sure, absolutely, point taken.
Now, taken for the Parsi community in particular, I'd love to see more young, enterprising Parsis becoming entrepreneurs. And there are various attempts to foster this. There's a Zoroastrian Chamber of Commerce that's trying to do this very explicitly. There are some, especially now, new economy startups that Parsis are involved in. But for too many years, I think we haven't had some really good Parsi success stories. And we need some to inspire more young, capable, bright Parsis to become entrepreneurs and get into business for themselves.
Naushad, this is a question I'm asking pretty much everybody, and I've got the most interesting answers. But is there a Parsi way of doing business? I mean, you mentioned how there are always characters that you can pull out from your own family history, etc. But is there a certain way of doing business?
So there is, I think there actually probably is.
Yeah.
So so let me give you the good and the bad. The good is, what people will talk about, right? There is, I think, a standard of ethics in business, which is something that we're very proud of. It's and I think it's something that is very. I would only encourage it to be more and more visible and clear, and hope that becomes more of an example for more and more businesses. Again, there are non-Parsi businesses that are completely as ethical as these Parsi businesses. So I don't think it's something that is owned by Parsi businesses, but it's certainly something that characterizes Parsi businesses, and it's something that we should be very proud of and preserve. Second, there is a dharamsala. Dharamsalas are these Parsi homes that look after people. There is sometimes a dharamsala element to Parsi companies.
Like what?
Yeah, which is good and bad. Which is that people are around for a long period of time in these companies. I mean, all the companies that I'm talking about have people who stay with them for many, many years. And that's a good thing. It's, I would say, 90% good and 10% bad. Yeah? The 90% that's good is it generally involves a deep sense of loyalty and commitment to the company. It generally involves real investment in one's own skill sets and depth of knowledge. And that all shows up in really excellent ways of doing things. The 10% that's bad is that you sometimes tolerate then a lack of short-term performance, certainly, which you could probably be more demanding about. So there is that negative, but I think it's a relatively small negative in a much broader sea of positives.
The Parsis today stand for good, solid businesses and are proud bearers of a great legacy that has taken many forms.